English translation, 373rd contact. Friday, the 21st of January, 2005, 017 HRS.
Peace to greet you, dear friend. Just now, I was watching a program on television about the so-called Atkins diet, which goes back to a Dr. Robert C. Atkins. He wrote a book called New Diet Revolution. The idea is that human beings who are overweight should lose it by eating almost exclusively protein products and no carbohydrates. The whole thing seems a bit suspect to me, because I think that such a one-sided diet can cause deficiencies of vital vitamins, enzymes, minerals, and trace elements over time, and cause some kind of damage. Unfortunately, I did not catch all of the program because I was called by telephone and prevented from following the program correctly for a long time. So I only saw about a third of it, just the beginning, and then a bit in between. The question: are you familiar with Dr. Atkins and the Atkins diet?
Of course, because as a doctor I am constantly dealing with the medical issues and therefore also with the diets, how they develop on Earth.
Aha. And what do you think of this diet? For my part, I simply do not trust it, at least not what I have noticed on TV, that you can eat meat, fish, eggs, and other proteins in large quantities and lose weight. The frowned-upon foods that have carbohydrates must simply be foods that have carbohydrates. It was pointed out several times in the program that people had actually lost weight with this Atkins diet. If this is true, which may be assumed to be the case, then I do not understand what the reason for the weight loss is, and I also wonder whether such a diet can be described as recommendable.
For a certain period of time it is safe to do this kind of diet, but in no case should it be used permanently. It is a fact that a pure protein diet causes deficiencies of vital substances such as vitamins, enzymes, minerals, and trace elements, etc. in the long run, as you have already assumed yourself. The simple reason that the high-protein diet leads to significant weight loss is that after a certain and short period of time, much less is eaten, after which large quantities are eaten as if in a ravenous appetite. Protein-rich food has the property that hunger is satisfied more quickly, and a long-lasting feeling of fullness is quickly created, which means that much less is eaten. Food rich in carbohydrates is quickly burned in the organism, whereby the resulting energy is also used up very quickly. Pure, protein-rich food, on the other hand, requires a much longer period of burning, and therefore releases the resulting energy more slowly, so that the body and the whole inner organism are supplied with it for a longer period of time. De facto, the food also remains longer in the stomach, resulting in a longer feeling of satiety, so that no feeling of hunger can occur, and further food intake is postponed, and therefore much less is eaten, which of course automatically leads to weight loss. 9. However, this process must not be applied for a long time, otherwise deficiency symptoms will occur, as I have explained. For a short time, the Atkins diet can be used, but never as a permanent diet, because otherwise irreparable damage can occur due to the deficiency symptoms.
So it can be used for a short time, but in the long run it's harmful.
That is the meaning of my words.
Then something else. Again and again there are people who say that there have always been natural disasters, such as earthquakes, seaquakes, floods, hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, hurricanes, fires, droughts, and storms of all kinds, as well as environmental destruction, air pollution, etc., and that everything that happens in recent times in this regard is no worse than anything that has happened before. It is also said that just because television, newspapers, and journals are now sensationalizing everything, the whole thing looks worse than in the past. What do you think? And what do you say to the fact that with regard to the Indonesian catastrophe, sectarian prophets of doom are already trying to make capital out of it again and instill fear and terror into their followers?
Such speeches regarding the sameness of natural disasters and their effects, etc., are nonsensical, because they do not correspond to the truth. Of course, it is so that through today's possibilities of spreading catastrophe reports, etc., through the various media, wide gates are opened, with everything being sensationally opened, exploited, and sold. But that has nothing to do with the fact that the natural disasters would have remained the same as they have always been. The fact is that the total extent of all natural disasters has increased in its strength as well as their number. The strength of typhoons, tornadoes, hurricanes, and hurricanes alone, of rain, snow, and hail, has increased by 38% since 1914, just as the number of seaquakes and earthquakes has increased by 27% since then to the present day. Volcanic activity has also increased by 6% worldwide. All natural disasters have fallen completely out of the normal natural range, and in fact, the Earth is in a state of development that should not bring such natural disasters with it. Overall, our research, analysis, and records prove this. So it is very mistaken to say that everything in this regard is happening in the old conventional way, because the truth results in other facts. And what the future holds in terms of natural disasters can indeed be described as apocalyptic. And man himself has contributed a great deal to this, for an unbelievable 67% of the events in this regard can be traced back to him, and if he does not come to his senses quickly, this percentage may even increase. But the fact that sectarian elements are already at work again and are prophesying an imminent end of the world as a result of the seaquake catastrophe in Indonesia, etc., and claiming that this is a punishment from God is of course absolute nonsense and purely sectarian madness. The world will not end, nor is there any God-given who will let a punitive action befall the earth. Every religious deity is no more and no less than an imaginary fantasy figure, like their alleged punishments. In any case, a thinking in this regard and a concurrent religious or sectarian faith are based only on human fantasy products of the most diverse elements, who want to see themselves as proclaimers of God, or who quite deliberately deceive their fellow human beings with all this nonsense. Natural events of any kind are therefore never punitive actions of a deity, just as the belief in a God-induced end of the world is completely nonsensical. If the world is destroyed, then it is solely the fault of man, who, through overpopulation, causes all the forces of nature to overflow, because his actions disturb the natural course of the elements to such an extent that this inevitably leads to degenerations in nature and on the planet. Thus, an end of the world can also be seen only symbolically, because an end of the world would consist in a complete destruction of the entire ecosystem, and with it the entire life possibilities of man, as well as the fauna and flora, but not in the sense that the earth would be destroyed and annihilated to its very foundations. This is what we are talking about when we speak of doom, and this is not in any way related to a belief of sectarian or religious form, nor to a punishment of a god.
And what do you think the resurrender of the U.S. warmonger Bush means for the world?
Never before in human history has there been a ruler who has posed such a great danger to all humanity on earth and to world peace. The question is how stupid all those must be who voted for this man and still cheer him today.
The man of the earth can hardly be taught, because he thinks in completely wrong ways. This is not only evident in this, but also in other ways, because the Swiss government now wants to support cars, etc., to introduce a CO2 tax, because the governments are mistakenly of the opinion that they could thereby stop CO2 emissions, and thus the greenhouse effect. The poor madmen cannot think that this will benefit an old hat, because CO2 production continues to increase at the same rate as the increase in overpopulation. In my opinion, the only way to remedy the situation is to drastically reduce overpopulation through an appropriate temporal cycle by means of a rigorous and worldwide halt to births. Any other problems that exist on Earth and in humanity are also growing steadily with the further increase in overpopulation, because if a problem is mastered in a certain time, then at the time of mastering it has already become much bigger again, because the overpopulation has grown enormously again in the meantime. In this way, a problem can practically never be solved, because every attempt to solve a problem is like a drop on a hot stone under which the heat is fanned enormously.
You already recognize the problem in the 50s of the 20th century where it is.
Even then, I wrote a letter in which I listed everything that the future will bring due to overpopulation, how the environment and the Earth's resources will be destroyed, and with it the balance of the planet and all of nature and fauna and flora. At that time I copied about 3,000 copies on a transfer printer and sent the letter all over the world to governments, newspapers, radio stations, organizations, universities, journals, as well as to authorities in schools, etc. But I never received an answer. Unfortunately, I do not have the letter anymore because it burned when my apartment in Hinterberg burned down. Otherwise, I could give it to you to read.
I know your letter, my friend, because I have received the copy of the letter you gave her from Asket. If you want, I will try to get Zafanat Panik so that you can read it directly into your computer. All I need is one of your disks, which he can then process.
And you think that is actually possible?
For Zafanat Panik, this does not pose any problems because he knows earthly computer technology better than all earthly computer technicians combined. He is also in possession of all earthly computer equipment in use on Earth since 1996.
I gladly accept your offer, which would allow me to insert the letter that we wrote at the time of our conversation here.
Your wish shall be granted. But we also have a wish which I should give you for the core group members. This is that our spirit leadership would very much like to know the attitude, understanding, and opinion of the core group members regarding the position of women in Figu, and the position of Billy in Figu, and with the core group members, and the position of the core group members in Figu. It should be remembered that some suitable group members, together or individually, will each write a somewhat detailed description of the individual topics, if possible in the form of a small brochure. The idea is that, with regard to the position of women in Figu, it is explained in detail what form there is between women and men, or how the cooperation and rights between men and women are regulated in Figu, and what you teach in this respect.
Eduard Albert Meyer Niederflachs, 1253 Bulak ZH, Switzerland.
To all those in authority in the world, responsible for the welfare of the earth and its entire humanity are, in addition to the individual human beings of all peoples, in the front line the authorities and their superior governments, and to all those in authority and government, as well as to every individual human being, I will speak the following words of admonition. My fatherly friend Svath instructed me prophetically and predictively in many a thing that will come to earth in the future and bring unpleasantness. These things, some of which can be changed, but some of which will inevitably come to pass, I will interpret as follows. It is only 6 years since the Second World War came to an inglorious end, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, and cost the lives of some 62 million human beings. Even atomic energy was used to murder hundreds of thousands of human beings and destroy their cities, through the irresponsible and criminal action of the USA when the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed by atomic bombs. All this, however, will unfortunately not be the end of all horrors, mass murders, wars, and acts of terror, unless the human beings of all nations finally become clever enough to remove their power-hungry government bosses from office and let them seize the hairpan. It is the people in every country who elect the rulers, as a rule. Unfortunately, the wrong ones who first make big promises and then, when they are in power, unleash war and terror and cast a spell over the people with lies and deceit, making them subservient to their superiors and oblivious to the real truth. This, however, will have evil consequences in the future, for worldwide state powers, if the people do not intervene, will involve the human beings more and more in wars, terror, and hatred, until the whole thing assumes uncontrollable forms worldwide. The time for this is not far off, for these monstrous things are already smoldering in a smoldering fire that will become an open fire within the next few years. There is still time to stop the monstrosity that is prophesied for the future of all earthly humanity and for the earth and its nature. Effective countermeasures can still change everything for the better. If the peoples and all those responsible in the governments, the authorities, the sciences, and the military, as well as all those otherwise responsible, make every effort to stop all evils and to bring about a positive change. If this does not happen, then unimagined horrors are in store, with the world power USA leading the sword of death and destruction and annihilation in every respect, while Israel and all those states that will nestle in hypocritical friendship with the USA will also follow in its wake, against the will of the sensible part of the respective people. Not only wars, terror, destruction, and annihilation with thousands of deaths and hundreds of thousands of murdered people will mark the future, but also an enormous overpopulation, through whose fault all laws of nature will be thrown out of joint. All storms will increase through the fault of human beings and take on ever more violent forms, such as hailstorms, snowstorms, and rain floods, but also the ozone layer will be very dangerously damaged. The longer the floods continue, the more they will become the order of the day, because overpopulation will turn the floodplain forests and plains into residential areas, so that the wild waters of the rain floods will find their way into the houses of human beings, because they can no longer escape into uninhabited floodplain areas. Landslides and avalanches, as well as earthquakes and seaquakes and storms of all kinds, hurricanes and typhoons, hurricanes and tornadoes, will increase in number and become ever more violent and destructive. And overpopulation will also be to blame for this, because overpopulation will cause tremendous negative effects, and thus unnatural climate change, which will already begin to have a very detrimental effect on the world in just 1 decade from today. The immense masses and weights of the cities and villages are constantly harassing the inner structures of the earth more and more, which affects the tectonics, which inevitably leads to increased tectonic shifts and faults, which will cause immense quakes worldwide, whereby the dead will ultimately number in the hundreds of thousands and millions. And these quakes will also have an influence on the entire earthly volcanism, consequently also the volcanoes, which are interconnected in many ways worldwide, will become more and more frequent and more destructive. This, too, will claim many human lives, especially in those areas where dwellings are unreasonably built too close to the volcanoes, as is also the case on the beaches of seas, on great rivers and lakes, where buildings are erected directly on the shores, which will be flooded by storm waves and tidal waves on an enormous scale and will claim very many human lives. But that is not all, for the ever-increasing overpopulation, which is predicted to grow to over 6 billion within 50 years, will cause many enormous and insoluble problems. Famines will increase, while old diseases thought to have been eradicated will return. Mass tourism from the industrialized countries will flood them with economic refugees from all over the world, just as an enormous asylum seeker problem will also become an insoluble problem. And it is predicted that at the end of the 1980s, the economic boom will collapse, and a tremendous and unprecedented unemployment will break out worldwide, which will increase crime by the unemployed, as well as by criminal gangs from the so-called third world countries, which will spread into the industrialized countries and will not even shy away from murder when they pursue their misdeeds. National debts are also increasing immeasurably, as is terrorist extremism and neo-Nazism, etc. Prostitution, as predicted by Svath, is taking on unbelievable forms and is being brought out into the global public sphere in such a way that even children are not spared. In the next few decades, prostitution will become a respectable profession, officially recognized by the authorities and also subject to taxation. Television, which has already been invented, will become part of everyday life in every family, as will the technology of computers, which is already being diligently worked on in America, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union. Television and computers will become the most important information media, but also the most important forms of public prostitution advertising. In the course of the next 50 years, human beings will become cold in their thoughts and feelings, as a result of which interpersonal relationships will bear ever stranger blossoms and will only be purposeful. True love will become a rarity, and many marriages will take place only to indulge in a certain status traded in prestige and money. The result will be that many marriages will no longer last, families will be destroyed, and the offspring will be both sexually abused and also become antisocial and neglected. People, especially the young, will begin to lead a life that is often only oriented towards drugs as early as the end of the 1950s. And later, when the time of the 1980s approaches, the drug problem will become rampant, just as only pleasure will be important and destructive and disharmonious sounds will characterize the world of music, affecting the psyche and causing the entire behavior of those human beings to fall into the negative, who orient themselves towards this destructive type of music. In the field of sectarianism, more and more supposedly chosen by God are appearing, who exploit their believers financially, make them bondage, and even drive them to suicide. The irresponsible will use the time to become rich through their believing followers, especially when they spread fear and terror with regard to the millennium change, because, as they will claim, the world is supposed to end in the year 2000. They are not afraid to spread lies that extraterrestrials will save the chosen ones, but of course only if they deliver large sums of money to the cult leaders. There is much more to come from the growing overpopulation, which is basically the real source of all evil things in the future, for the greater the overpopulation becomes, the more enormous the resulting problems will be. Thus, new rampant spreading diseases will appear, already in the coming 80s, which will claim millions of human lives, rampant spreading diseases that are transmitted from animals to human beings, just as, in a more distant future, rampant spreading diseases will be introduced to the Earth from outer space. All this, however, that the rampantly spreading diseases come from animals and spread to human beings, will be denied by those responsible and slandered as liars by those who know the real truth. If the world and its humanity are thus ruined, then the human being of the earth is himself the author of it, whereby he creates the real cause by driving his overpopulation into ever higher numbers. So it will not be an imaginary god of some religion or sect who will determine the coming monstrous problems and excesses, but solely the human beings of earth, who in their delusion believe themselves to be the highest and most powerful being in the universe, far higher than creation can ever be. Through man's guilt, through his overpopulation, through his megalomania, through his unreasonableness and self-importance, he challenges all the forces of nature, which rebel together with the earth and defend themselves against the degenerating machinations of earth humans. So the forces of nature overflow on the earth, together with the earth itself, because the human being disturbs and destroys the entire natural course of the elements and of life. All this I have to say, for it is the prophetic and at the same time predictive truth. Take courage, all of you who hear these words from me, to consider what I have said, and to draw the correct conclusions from it, and to act correctly, for there is still time to do so, but it is already beginning to slip between your fingers. Consider this prophecy and prediction and act in the sense of a change for the better. Also make everything public for all human beings of the earth, through teachings in all media, in order to achieve a change and transformation in a positive sense, and in order to protect the earth and its entire humanity from all evil, from all degenerations, the many deaths and destructions, and from the step into destruction. All of you who receive my letter have the opportunity, the might, and the responsibility to save the earth and its humanity from all that I have revealed to you. Do not procrastinate, but act, and act quickly, for time is short. If you do not act immediately, then you will be just as responsible for it when the prophecy comes true, as well as all those who will see to its fulfillment in the future.
Edward Albert Meyer.
In this respect, I would advise that some women do this work together. The other two topics are thought of in a similar context, but in relation to you, it should also be made clear how you behave towards the core group members, how you teach, and how you are seen as a person and a proclaimer. This task, I think, would be very suitable for Hans Georg. For the topic of the position of the core group members in FIGU, for example, the scope of duties and the equal value of all work should be provided for, as well as the attitude of the group members towards you and your equality with all group members.
You have another concern, my friend. I would like to ask you what the whole thing is all about. The spiritual leadership knows everything very well, so I do not understand why you want us to do this work.
Your work should serve three purposes. On the one hand, we want to show our people on Era how the things mentioned above are handled and practiced in the core group in order to give them an impression of the whole. Secondly, we also want to submit your work to some races of our federation as an example to be followed. And thirdly, everything can be useful to you if you make and distribute appropriate writings from the final products to make known to all interested people your circumstances of the mentioned topics.
You have come up with something, my friend. But I am going to present your request to the group, because ultimately it's up to the group members to decide what you want.
For my part, I think that everything will turn out as we want it to.
We shall see. But what about the foresight with regard to the warmongering President of the USA, George Walker Bush, and with regard to the threatening possibility that this madman will actually break into Iran by war, and thus perhaps really trigger a third world war in the foreseeable future?
In this regard, I will inform you in due course when the relevant work is completed. It is not yet time.
Thanks. So patience is to be practiced, but it also means that patience brings roses instead of war in Iran.
The hope that roses will sprout instead of thorns in this regard is unfortunately very small at the moment. But now, dear friend Edward, it is time for me to go. In a few days, I will tell you, Quetzal will come by and take care of things at the center. Then I will see you next Thursday, where we will do our usual corrective work with Bernadette. Goodbye, my friend. Ah, and before I forget, greetings from my two daughters, Simyase and Pleja, but also from Asket, Nera, and all the others you know personally. Salome and goodbye.
Thank you for all the greetings, which I am happy to return. Take care, dear friend.